So, if you think back to 1979, a guy working on the floor of, say, a tire factory in the Midwest could reasonably expect to afford a 3-bedroom house, support a family, own a car, and take a vacation every year.
Right. Just on a single income.
Exactly, on a single income. But today, you have, a software engineer or a mid-level manager walking around with a literal supercomputer in their pocket. They are instantly connected to the sum total of all human knowledge.
Yeah.
And they're splitting rent with 3 roommates, eating instant ramen, and, panic checking their bank balance. Welcome to the deep dive.
It's crazy when you put it like that.
It is. And that's the central paradox of our time, is just staring us right in the face.
Yeah.
By every metric of technological progress, you are living in a sci-fi utopia.
Right. Absolutely.
Yet if you ask almost anyone, there is this heavy lingering reality that simply surviving, let alone thriving, feels exponentially more difficult than it did for previous generations.
It really is the defining friction of the modern era. I mean, we've engineered a world of unimaginable digital abundance.
Oh, for sure.
But the baseline physical requirements for a stable life, they just seem to be slipping further out of reach for a massive portion of the population. We're essentially living in 2 parallel realities.
Yeah, and today we are going to figure out exactly how we got trapped between them. We have a massive stack of sources to get through today.
We really do. It's a lot of ground to cover.
We're spanning macroeconomic data, sociology, cultural critiques, and, oddly enough, a very specific subgenre of electronic music.
Which is fascinating, by the way. I can't wait to get to that part.
Same here. We are going to separate the psychological illusions from the brutal economic math of what it actually costs to exist today. But before we tear into this, I need to set a hard ground rule.
Yeah, this is important.
So these sources touch on some heavily debated political and economic systems. We're going to be looking at critiques of capitalism, the legacy of the welfare state, and arguments from both left-wing and right-wing think tanks.
Right.
I want to be crystal clear with you, the listener. We are not taking sides. We are not endorsing any political ideology here.
Exactly. No sides.
Our job is strictly to unpack the arguments as they exist in the source material so you can understand the architecture of this modern crisis impartially.
Because, I mean, the only way to navigate a problem this multifaceted is to map out all the perspectives without prejudice. The math of inflation doesn't care about your political affiliation,
It really doesn't. And neither does the psychological toll of a housing crisis.
Right.
So let's start with the psychology, because before we can look at the wallet, we kind of have to look at the mind.
Right.
Our sources point us to Greg Easterbrook's concept of the progress paradox.
Yeah, that's a great starting point.
The premise is that if you zoom out and look at the raw statistics, global disease rates are dropping, life expectancy is rising, homes are larger, violence is historically low, humanity's doing great on paper.
On paper, sure.
But yet, on a subjective level, people feel incredibly worse.
And the sheer scale of the psychological distress is what makes Easterbrook's paradox so compelling. I mean, he relies heavily on a comprehensive Yale University study that focused specifically on wealthy Western nations.
Right, so we're talking about places that are already well off.
Exactly. We are talking about regions where people generally possess solid incomes, vast personal freedoms, and unprecedented access to healthcare and calories.
Yep.
But out of a population of roughly 500 million people across North America and Europe, the study found that 100 million are seriously depressed.
Wow. 100 million?
Yeah. The rate of clinical depression has skyrocketed tenfold over recent generations. We've seen an absolute flood of SSRIs and antidepressants into the market.
Right.
So you are forced to ask a very uncomfortable question, right? If the physical environment is objectively safer and more resource-rich than at any point in the history of the species, what is the mechanism that is manufacturing all of this misery?
Right, because it's clearly not just a few people having a bad day, it's structural.
Absolutely structural.
The material points to Professor Martin Seligman, a former president of the American Psychological Association. And he diagnoses 4 specific drivers of this modern discontent.
Yeah, his breakdown is really insightful.
The first one is extreme individualism. Basically the idea that we have severed ties to our larger communities, meaning every single failure you experience is entirely your own fault, and every setback feels like a catastrophic indictment of your worth.
And that ties directly into his second driver, which is the modern self-esteem craze.
Wait, I actually want to push on that for a second. Because on the surface, teaching people to have high self-esteem sounds inherently good, right?
Right.
Why is a prominent psychologist claiming it's a driver of mass depression?
Well, it's because of how it was implemented. So Seligman argues that the self-esteem movement created an artificial baseline where you are expected to feel absolutely exceptional all the time.
Oh, I see.
Historically, self-esteem was something you earned through action, by contributing to your community, mastering a difficult skill, or overcoming adversity.
Right, you had to actually do something to feel good about yourself.
Exactly. But the modern iteration flipped that entirely. It became an unearned prerequisite. You are told from childhood that you are inherently flawless.
But reality is full of friction and failure.
Right, and mediocrity. When a person primed with this artificial self-esteem encounters the actual brutality of the job market or, say, a failed relationship, they just don't have the psychological calluses to handle it.
Man, that is rough.
The gap between their mandated self-image and their reality, it just causes a depressive collapse.
That makes an uncomfortable amount of sense, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So his third driver is a media-led culture of victimology, which trains us to feel constantly threatened and helpless. And the fourth is runaway consumerism.
Yeah.
I really want to zero in on the media aspect
Mm.
because the source material brings up this fantastic thought experiment.
Oh, the Dalai Lama one. Yes, I love this.
Yeah. So imagine the Dalai Lama visits Vancouver today. He looks around and sees incredible material wealth, functioning infrastructure, people with a level of luxury that kings centuries ago just couldn't fathom.
Right.
But if you lock him in a hotel room and force him to watch a local TV news broadcast, the source uses Key RO in Seattle as the archetype, he would think he had descended into a post-apocalyptic war zone. It's just wall-to-wall coverage of abductions, murders, looming economic collapse, and global pandemics.
Easterbrook calls this the culture of complaint. The media apparatus, driven by the absolute necessity to capture human attention for ad revenue, has optimized itself to trigger our deep-seated threat responses.
It's a complete hijacking of our evolutionary wiring. I mean, think about a worker in the early 1900s. Let's picture a lumberjack working in the Pacific Northwest.
Okay, yeah.
What were his actual daily anxieties? He was worried about a massive tree crushing him. He was worried about getting caught in a freezing rainstorm and catching pneumonia, or dropping his axe on his foot.
Very physical threats.
Exactly. His anxieties were intensely physical, entirely localized, and immediate.
Mm.
When he went home and sat by the fire, the threat was over. His nervous system could downregulate.
Right, he could actually relax.
He was not lying awake in his cabin hyperventilating over a bank robbery 3 states away, or a geopolitical conflict on the other side of the planet.
No, of course not.
But today, you carry a device that delivers a minute-by-minute, high-definition feed of every tragedy, crisis, and controversy happening everywhere on Earth straight into your optic nerve.
And the biological implication of that is profound. Like you said, the human nervous system is designed to release cortisol and adrenaline to help you escape a tiger or fight off a rival tribe.
Right, short bursts.
Yes, it is a system built for acute, short-term spikes of stress. What we've done is subject ourselves to a continuous, low-grade drip of global disaster.
It's exhausting just thinking about it.
You are sitting safely in a climate-controlled room, but your brain is receiving signals that you are in constant mortal danger from threats you have zero physical ability to fight or flee from.
So it just generates this sea of free-floating anxiety.
Exactly. And as the author Jane Hammerslough notes in her book Dematerializing, our primary coping mechanism for this ambient dread is to gorge ourselves on material consumption. We buy things to feel a fleeting sense of control and comfort.
Well, hold on. I have to step in here and challenge this framing. Because it feels like society is trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom.
Okay, how so?
Well, we keep pouring in more consumer goods, right? The smart TVs, the fast fashion, the endless apps. But the anxiety leaks out just as fast.
Right, yeah.
The psychological argument you're laying out implies that this is largely a mindset problem.
Yeah.
That we're just overwhelmed by media and whining about having too many choices while sitting in the lap of luxury.
I see where you're going with this.
So is the bucket actually shrinking? I mean, is this unease purely in our heads, or is the material reality of trying to build a life actually mathematically harder than it was for that tire factory worker in 1979?
That is the exact pivot we need to make here. Because the psychological overload is very real, but it is acting as a smokescreen for a much more insidious economic reality.
Okay, unpack that for me.
The past didn't just feel more abundant because they lacked 24/7 cable news. It felt more abundant because the fundamental economic architecture of thriving was drastically cheaper.
Okay.
To understand this, we have to transition from the mind to the wallet.
And this brings us to an incredibly revealing piece of research from Orrin Cass at the Manhattan Institute.
Yes, the COTI index.
Right. He introduces a metric called the Cost of Thriving Index, or COTI. And he opens with a riddle that strikes right at the heart of the paradox we are discussing.
It's a great riddle.
So in 1979, the median male working full-time in America earned $314 a week. In 2018, that exact same demographic counterpart earned $1,026 a week. The riddle is simple. Who's better off?
Well, on its face, the 2018 worker makes triple the money.
Right, it looks like a huge win.
But you intuitively know we have to adjust for inflation to see what that money can actually buy. And the problem Cass exposes is that our gold standard inflation metrics, the Consumer Price Index, known as CPI, and the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index, PCE, they give radically conflicting answers.
Wait, they conflict.
Massively. If you run the numbers through CPI, the 2018 workers' wages actually lost ground. They are worth 6% less than the 1979 wages.
Wow, okay.
But if you use PCE, the 2018 wages look like a massive upgrade, worth 13% more.
Okay, if the official metrics are literally contradicting each other, how is anyone supposed to know the truth of their own bank account? I mean, if CPI says I'm poorer and PCE says I'm richer, one of those formulas is lying to me.
Well, they aren't intentionally lying, but they are capturing different abstract macroeconomic realities that completely miss the lived experience of a household budget.
Right, because they're just averages.
Exactly. They measure aggregate changes in price levels across the entire economy, but they don't capture the specific constraints of trying to maintain a standard middle-class existence. And that is why the Cost of Thriving Index is so vital. It throws out the abstract formulas and simply asks, what does a normal family actually need to buy?
Let's look at the COTI basket, because it is incredibly modest. It consists of 4 major killers for a family of 4.
Yeah, just 4 basic things.
First, rent for a 3-bedroom house at the 40th percentile of the local market. So slightly below average, not luxury.
Right.
Second, a standard family health insurance premium. Third, the cost of 1 semester of public college tuition. And fourth, the cost of owning and operating a single car, driving it roughly 15,000 miles a year.
That's it.
Yeah, we aren't talking about yachts, organic groceries, or European vacations here.
Yeah.
This is the baseline requirement for participating in modern society without falling into poverty.
And here is the brutal mathematical reality that the index reveals. In 1985, if you took that median male weekly wage, it required 30 weeks of work to afford everything in that basket for the year. 30 weeks.
Leaving you with 22 weeks of pay to cover everything else. Food, clothing, savings, emergency funds, entertainment. You had breathing room.
Lots of breathing room.
Yeah.
Now, roll the tape forward to 2018. To afford that exact same basket of 4 items, using the median weekly wage of 2018, it took 53 weeks of work.
Which is mathematically impossible for a single human being, seeing as there are only 52 weeks in a calendar year.
Exactly.
A full-time job at the median wage in 2018 was literally insufficient to afford the basic pillars of a middle-class life before you even bought a single loaf of bread or a winter coat.
It's wild. It requires you to go into debt, or it forces a 2-income trap where both parents must work full-time just to tread water, completely upending family dynamics and childcare.
The financial margin of error has just been completely erased.
Completely erased, yeah.
But I need to understand the mechanics of this. How can the official government inflation numbers, the ones that dictate interest rates and policy, tell us everything is relatively fine, while the COTI shows a family is essentially drowning? Where is the blind spot?
The blind spot is hidden within the methodology of traditional inflation metrics, specifically 2 deeply flawed concepts when applied to household survival: quality adjustment and substitution.
Okay, let's break those down.
Let's tackle quality adjustment first.
Right.
The Bureau of Labor Statistics has a mandate to measure the price of identical goods over time. But technology changes. Imagine they are tracking the price of a television.
Okay, a TV.
In 1996, a bulky, standard-definition tube TV might have cost $500. In 2018, a sleek, flat-screen, 4K, high-definition smart TV also costs around $500.
Right, so the price stayed the same.
No, because the BLS economists apply a hedonic quality adjustment. A hedonic quality adjustment. They look at the 2018 smart TV and calculate its features. The resolution, the internet connectivity, the weight. They determine that if you tried to buy a TV with those exact capabilities back in 1996, assuming the technology even existed in a lab somewhere, it would have cost, say, $17,000.
Oh, wow.
Therefore, in the government's inflation spreadsheet, the price of televisions hasn't stayed flat. It has plummeted by 97%. It registers as massive deflation, which drags down the overall inflation rate.
Okay, hold on. Let me step in here.
Yeah.
Isn't that technically fair? I mean, I am looking at my own TV right now. It is objectively a masterpiece of engineering compared to the box I had in the 90s.
Sure.
If I am getting exponentially more value and utility for my money across the board with electronics, shouldn't the economic data reflect that I'm wealthier in terms of living standards?
You are absolutely getting more value from the television, but here is the fatal flaw when you apply that logic to your actual checking account. Quality does not pay the rent. Quality doesn't fund your kids' college tuition. If your budget for a new TV is $300, you are still spending $300 of your finite income. The fact that the BLS spreadsheet says your TV has $17,000 worth of 1996 equivalent value doesn't free up a single cent in your bank account to pay for your family's health insurance premium, which has tripled in actual dollar cost.
That makes total sense.
The inflation metric is measuring theoretical utility, but you have to survive on absolute dollar.
Oh, that is insidious. The government is telling me I'm richer because my phone is fast, but I can't eat the phone.
Exactly. And the second flaw, substitution, is just as distortive.
How does that one work?
The inflation basket assumes that if the price of a staple good skyrockets, consumers are rational and will just switch to a cheaper alternative. If the price of beef doubles, the formula assumes you'll stop buying beef and buy chicken instead.
Okay, I see.
Therefore, the inflation index doesn't register the full pain of the doubling of beef prices because it assumes you simply altered your lifestyle to avoid the pain.
It's like the government telling you that you aren't actually starving because even though a loaf of bread now costs $50, you can technically survive by eating the grass in your front yard for free.
Whoa.
They assume you'll just substitute bread for grass, so your cost of living hasn't increased.
That is a stark analogy, but mathematically it's not far off. And the core issue is that you cannot substitute your way out of participating in modern society. The Manhattan Institute source illustrates this beautifully.
For example.
Imagine a hypothetical economy where only two things exist: televisions and doctor visits. Over the decades, televisions become infinitely better and radically cheaper. Doctor visits, meanwhile, become insanely expensive. If you average them out, the inflation metric might read as 0. The economy looks perfectly stable on paper.
But the reality is you have a magnificent 8K home theater system, and when you find a lump on your neck, you can't afford to get a biopsy.
Precisely. The things that have gotten remarkably cheap are tradable goods manufactured globally. Electronics, clothing, toys. The things that have become impossibly expensive are the non-tradable foundational pillars of a secure life: healthcare, education, and above all, shelter.
Shelter. The absolute heaviest weight dragging down the modern budget. The cost of a roof over your head.
It's the biggest issue by far.
This brings us to a massive structural piece of the puzzle: the housing crisis and the generational wealth divide it has spawned. We have a deeply researched source from the Grattan Institute.
Yeah, their data is incredible.
They focus their data heavily on the Australian housing market, but they note, and anyone looking at the globe knows, that these exact trends are devastating major cities across North America and Europe as well.
Oh, universally. The housing data doesn't just show an increase in price, it shows a fundamental break in the economic continuum.
What do you mean?
If you look back to the early 2000s, the price of a typical home was roughly 4 times the median household income. Today, that ratio has doubled to over 8 times the median income. And in hyper-desirable urban centers like Sydney, Vancouver, or San Francisco, it is pushing 10 to 12 times the median income.
Let's ground that in reality. What does a multiplier of 10 actually mean for a human being trying to buy a house?
It means it's nearly impossible.
The Grattan Institute data shows that in the early 1990s, it took an average household about 6 years to save a standard 20% deposit. 6 years of discipline and budgeting. That is a goal you can visualize. You can see the finish line.
Right, it's doable.
Today,
Right.
that exact same savings rate will take over 12 years to reach a deposit. And that's assuming the target doesn't keep moving, which it constantly does.
And the downstream psychological and demographic effects of that delay are monumental. You are fundamentally altering the life trajectory of an entire generation.
Because they just can't get started.
Exactly. They are delaying marriage, delaying having children, or abandoning those milestones entirely because they lack the spatial and financial security. The home ownership rate for young people is in free fall.
Do we have the numbers on that?
We do. Among 25 to 29-year-olds, it dropped from 43% in 2001 down to 36%. For the 30 to 34-year-old bracket, it fell from 57% to 50%. And the damage is highly concentrated. It is falling fastest among the poorest 40% of each age cohort.
So we aren't just talking about a temporary affordability dip. We're looking at housing functioning as an engine for extreme wealth inequality.
It's the primary engine right now.
The Grattan report drops a statistic that made my jaw hit the floor. They looked at real income growth between 2003 and 2020. The lowest fifth of households, the working poor and lower middle class, saw their real incomes rise by about 26%.
Which sounds great.
On paper, yeah, that sounds like a massive victory for poverty reduction. But skyrocketing housing costs devoured more than half of that gain. After you pay rent, their real income gain over almost 2 decades was a measly 12%. Meanwhile, the highest fifth of households, the ones who already own property, saw a 43% real gain after housing costs.
It's really a tale of two economies. If you were fortunate enough or old enough to buy a home before the massive price escalations of the early 2000s, your wealth has steadily climbed on autopilot.
Just by sitting there.
Just by existing. It's largely driven by the unearned equity of your property value rising. But if you didn't buy in time, or if you are young and just entering the workforce, you are trapped in a vicious rental market characterized by record low vacancy rates, surging asking rents, and the constant threat of eviction.
Right.
Your income is being siphoned off to pay the mortgage of the person who bought the house 20 years ago.
It feels like a generational game of musical chairs.
That's a really good way to put it.
Except in this version of the game, the older generation bought all the chairs back in the 1990s when they were dirt cheap. They bolted those chairs to the floor, declared a monopoly on sitting, and are now renting those same chairs back to the youth at an enormous, ever-increasing premium.
And the mechanism driving that monopoly is critical to understand. Why did housing decouple so violently from incomes?
Right. Why didn't we just build more chairs?
The Grattan Institute highlights a massive structural failure. We have booming populations, changing demographics, and a heavy concentration of high-paying jobs in specific urban centers. The demand for housing in these areas is astronomical.
Sure.
But we simply have not built enough homes where people actually want and need to live. And the primary barrier isn't a lack of lumber or lack of land. It is restrictive land use planning rules.
You are talking about the NMBYs, not in my backyard.
Yes, NIMBYs.
Right.
But we need to understand the structural incentive behind NIMBYism. It's not just grumpy neighbors.
Okay, what is it then?
When a home transitions from being primarily a place for shelter into a highly financialized asset, often serving as a family's primary retirement vehicle, the homeowner is highly incentivized to protect the scarcity of that asset.
Of course.
Existing homeowners actively use local planning rules, council meetings, and zoning laws to block new medium or high-density development in their neighborhoods. They argue it will ruin the character of the neighborhood or cause traffic, but the economic reality is that blocking new supply preserves the artificial scarcity, which drives up their own property values.
Well, that is wild.
This localized refusal to allow new supply acts as a massive invisible transfer of wealth from younger, poorer renters to older, wealthier, incumbent homeowners.
Okay, so the cost of thriving has exploded. Housing is a gated community, healthcare is exorbitant, and education requires a mortgage-sized loan.
Pretty bleak.
But here is the glaring contradiction I can't shake. We just spent the beginning of this deep dive talking about how we have supercomputers in our pockets. We have global supply chains, robotics, algorithmic efficiency. We are churning out unprecedented technological output.
Right.
Shouldn't we be drowning in wealth? Why didn't our paychecks keep pace with this hyper-efficient world?
To solve that mystery, we have to look back at a fundamental rupture in the American economic engine that occurred in the 1970s.
Okay, let's go back.
It's a phenomenon economists call the Great Decoupling, popularized by MIT scholars Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee. For decades following World War II, the American economy operated on a fairly reliable social contract. Productivity and wages grew in tandem.
Meaning if you work harder, you get paid more.
Exactly. If a worker, aided by new machinery or better processes, produced more value per hour, their hourly compensation rose at a nearly identical rate. The lines on the graph moved together.
But then the lines broke. The Source of Material by Daphne Neal and Deepraj Mukherjee lays out the catastrophic numbers. Between 1973 and 2011, the productivity of the economy, the sheer amount of wealth and output generated per worker increased by nearly 80%.
Yeah.
But the hourly pay for the median worker rose only 10%. We generated an ocean of wealth, but the pipes redirecting it to the average worker were suddenly pinched shut. Where did all that money go?
Well, our sources point to a confluence of forces, heavily driven by the specific nature of recent technological change. We also have to fold in Peter Turchin's theory of elite overproduction, which explores how wealth concentrates at the top while stagnating in the middle.
Okay.
But the precise mechanical explanation for how technology gutted the median wage is best explained through Daron Acemoglu's theory of directed technical change.
So Acemoglu is arguing that technology isn't neutral. It doesn't just magically make everyone in a factory 10% richer. It picks winners and losers.
Exactly the dynamic. Previous waves of technology, like the assembly line, often made low-skilled workers vastly more productive, which justified higher wages for them.
Right.
But the technological progress of the last 40 years, primarily software, computing, and advanced robotics, has been heavily biased toward high-skilled workers.
Okay, how so?
If you are a software engineer, a data scientist, or a hedge fund manager, modern technology makes you exponentially more productive. You can manage global portfolios or write code that serves millions of users in an instant. Consequently, your wages soar. The source notes median incomes in tech hubs like Silicon Valley hitting $94,000 and climbing rapidly.
But if you are a worker performing what economists call routine tasks, the repetitive manual or cognitive work that used to make up the bulk of the middle class, the technology doesn't act as a tool to enhance your work. It acts as a replacement.
And the paper provides a deeply poignant case study to illustrate this mechanism. The rubber industry in Akron, Ohio, the heart of the Rust Belt.
Let's hear it.
In the decades after World War II, the tire industry employed tens of thousands of hourly union workers. They were making a solid, family-supporting wage doing routine manual labor. But in the 1970s and 80s, the global market demanded radial tires, which were far superior but much harder to manufacture. The industry had to retool, utilizing expensive, highly automated machinery and requiring advanced technical skills to operate and maintain it.
And the human toll was immediate.
Hmm.
The source details how in 1981 alone, Akron lost 1,220 hourly union workers. But the salary jobs, the engineers, the managers, the people directing the technology only lost 743 positions.
Yep.
The technology systematically hunted down the routine middle-class jobs and eliminated them.
And we must look at what happens to those displaced workers. They don't just disappear. By 1995, the secure, unionized manufacturing jobs were heavily slashed, and the jobs that replaced them in the local economy were primarily low-skill, non-unionized service jobs paying around $7.50 an hour.
Ah.
This is the mechanism that creates the polarization of the labor market.
I need to interject with the question everyone wonders when they hear about the Akron case study. Is automation just fundamentally evil? Is the narrative true that, the robots are stealing all the jobs and we're doomed?
Well,
Because when I look at the macroeconomic data today, overall unemployment is actually quite low. People have jobs. So if the robots stole the jobs, why is everyone still working?
that is a vital distinction to make. Automation, contrary to popular dystopian fears, rarely creates mass, permanent, society-wide unemployment. What directed technical change does is create severe polarization.
Polarization.
It hollows out the middle. Think of the modern job market as a barbell. On one massive end of the barbell, you have the high-paying, cognitive, technical, and managerial jobs. The people designing the software, managing the AI, and directing the capital.
The winners of the decoupling.
Yes. On the other end of the barbell, you have a massive explosion of low-paying, precarious service jobs.
Why service jobs specifically?
Because while a robot can easily weld a car chassis or a software program can instantly do a company's payroll, it is incredibly difficult and expensive to design a robot that can navigate a chaotic hotel room to clean it, or cut a squirming child's hair, or deliver a pizza up 3 flights of stairs.
Oh, that makes sense. The physical variance is too high.
Exactly. The source notes that service sector jobs grew by 30% precisely because they are insulated from automation.
So everyone is still working, but the nature of the work is degraded. The middle of the barbell, the clerical work, the basic manufacturing, the data entry, the jobs that required a high school diploma but paid enough to hit the 30-week OTI basket, that middle has been evaporated by software.
Completely evaporated.
You are either propelled up into the high-skill cognitive tier, or you are pushed down into the low-wage, non-routine service tier.
And this ties directly into Peter Turchin's concept of elite overproduction.
Okay, let's bring that in.
As the middle class hollows out, society tells everyone that the only way to survive is to climb into the high-skill tier of the barbell. Get a degree, get a master's, go to law school, so we produce a massive surplus of highly credentialed individuals, the elites who expect high-paying, prestigious jobs.
But the economy isn't generating enough of those elite positions to absorb all these newly minted graduates.
Exactly. So you end up with tens of thousands of people with advanced degrees fighting viciously for a static number of top-tier jobs.
which just drives wages down.
Yes. This hyper-competition depresses wages even for the educated class, leads to credential inflation, where a master's degree becomes the new high school diploma, and creates a massive cohort of frustrated, downwardly mobile elites who feel the system has betrayed them. It is a recipe for immense societal friction.
Okay, so we have supercharged software, making the elite hyper-productive while hollowing out the middle class and creating a brutal service economy. But wait, if productivity is up across the board and we have this unbelievable digital infrastructure, how can some economists look at the modern era and argue that we are actually living through a period of technological
No,
stagnation?
I know it sounds weird at first.
Right. When you have AI generating art and algorithms predicting protein structures, claiming we are stagnating sounds absurd.
It sounds absurd until you step away from the screen and look at the physical world. This brings us to the profound work of Tyler Cowen in his book, The Great Stagnation, and the deep cultural critique by Jason Crawford.
Okay, what's Cowan's take?
Cowen's central thesis is that the explosive growth of American economic history from the 1800s to the 1970s was driven by the consumption of low-hanging fruit. We had massive expanses of free, resource-rich land. We had the one-time massive economic leap of introducing universal basic education, taking millions of illiterate farmhands and turning them into a literate industrial workforce.
Right, massive leaps.
And we had relatively easy, paradigm-shifting scientific breakthroughs that could be implemented quickly.
And Cowan argues that by the 1970s, we had essentially eaten all that fruit. The land was settled, everyone who could benefit from a high school education was getting one, and the easy scientific discoveries had been commercialized. We hit a plateau.
Yes, and Crawford captures the cultural disillusionment of this plateau by quoting Peter Thiel's Founders Fund, which coined an incredibly famous cynical motto. We wanted flying cars. Instead, we got 140 characters.
Oh, referencing Twitter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It encapsulates a deep, jaded realization that our technological progress narrowed drastically from mastering the physical universe to optimizing digital communication.
Let's compare historical eras to truly grasp the scale of what we lost. Crawford points out that during the Second Industrial Revolution, roughly spanning the late 19th to the early 20th centuries, humanity experienced 5 simultaneous, world-shattering technological revolutions.
5 of them.
Yeah. We had the commercialization of oil and the internal combustion engine. We had the mass rollout of electric power to cities and homes. We had electronic communications via the telegraph and telephone. We had the birth of industrial chemistry, creating modern materials.
Yeah.
And we had the widespread acceptance of germ theory and the advent of modern medicine.
It is almost impossible for a modern mind to comprehend the sheer velocity of that physical transformation.
It really is.
In the span of a single human lifetime, a person went from riding a horse by candlelight and dying of minor infections to driving a Ford Model T, turning on incandescent lights, flying in airplanes, and taking antibiotics. Society was fundamentally reinvented across every physical, chemical, and biological dimension.
Now hold that up against the Third Industrial Revolution, which spans from the 1970s to today. In the last 50 years, we have really only had one true revolution: digital computing and the internet.
That's it.
We innovate endlessly and brilliantly in the realm of bits, software, code, media, algorithms, but we have utterly stagnated in the physical world of atoms, our energy generation, our physical transportation, our heavy manufacturing.
Crawford refers to these as the missing revolutions. If you look at the speculative science fiction of the 1950s and 60s, the trajectory was obvious. The future was nuclear power, space colonization, and hyperfast transit.
But it just didn't happen.
The physical world stalled. Today, nuclear power, hampered by immense regulatory burdens and public fear, provides less than 20% of U.S. electricity. Space travel effectively went into hibernation. The Apollo program landed on the moon and then ended in 1972.
Right.
Supersonic passenger travel, embodied by the Concorde, was retired in 2003 because the economics didn't work. Commercial passenger flights are actually slightly slower today than they were in the 1970s to save on fuel costs.
Slower? That's insane.
We don't have flying cars. We don't have cheap, limitless fusion energy. We stopped building the future.
There is a brilliant analogy from Eric Weinstein that Crawford mentioned, which makes this stagnation hauntingly visible. If you walk into a typical room today, let's say mid-level corporate office or a suburban living room, and you simply remove the screens, take out the laptops, the smartphones, the flat-screen TVs.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
If you look at what remains, that room looks basically identical to a room in 1973. The drywall, the drop ceiling, the HVAC system, the plumbing, the wooden desk, the coffee mug, the internal combustion engine in the car parked outside. The physical reality surrounding us stopped rapidly evolving half a century ago.
And this stagnation in atoms is the missing key to understanding the great decoupling and the housing crisis.
How so?
Well, if digital revolution is so incredibly massive, why hasn't it made the median worker wealthy enough to afford the cost of thriving basket? The answer lies in how digital technology interacts with GDP. Much of the digital revolution provides what economists call consumer surplus.
What's consumer surplus?
Think about services like Wikipedia, Google Maps, or YouTube. They provide incalculable utility and knowledge to humanity. They vastly improve your daily life, but they are entirely free to the end user.
And there is the trap. They don't generate the kind of massive, broad-based, blue-collar wage growth that came from, say, building the interstate highway system or electrifying the rural South or manufacturing millions of automobiles. You cannot pay your skyrocketing real-world rent with digital consumer surplus. You can watch an endless, mesmerizing stream of free 4K video on a device in your pocket, but that digital abundance does absolutely nothing to help you afford a $3,000 a month apartment or a medical bill.
It creates a profound, society-wide psychological whiplash. We are caught between two realities. Our digital space is accelerating at a breakneck, almost incomprehensible pace, demanding our constant attention, while our physical reality, our infrastructure, our housing supply, and our economic ability to secure a place within it is stagnating or actively decaying.
Which brings us perfectly to our next source from the CCC Journal, exploring a concept by sociologist Hartmut Rosa called frenetic standstill.
Yes, frenetic standstill.
Because that whiplash you just described, it is exhausting the human soul. Rosa argues that the defining feature of late-stage modern capitalism is that growth must continuously accelerate just to preserve the baseline status quo.
Just to stay in place.
Right. We are forced to run faster and faster on the treadmill just to avoid being thrown off the back. You have to work harder today just to afford the exact same life your parents had on a single income.
The author of the paper, Jamie Ranger, uses a phenomenal physical analogy to explain this feeling. He compares the sensation of modern life to the G-force experienced by a Formula One driver.
Oh, that's good.
You are moving at an incredible, terrifying speed, but the gravitational weight of that acceleration pins you to your seat. It paralyzes you.
Wow.
The sheer speed of modern technological and economic demands makes actual meaningful movement, like changing your career, fighting for institutional reform, or even just pausing to reflect, feel impossible because you are completely burdened by the crushing force of just trying to keep up with your emails and pay the rent.
It's the paradox of speed creating paralysis. And a huge engine of that G-force is what cultural theorist Dominic Pettman calls hypermodulation. Social media and digital communication tools don't just connect us, they force us into a state of relentless, excessive sociability.
Yes, that's exactly it.
We check our phones constantly, driven by this low-grade panic that we might miss a critical Slack message from our boss, or an opportunity for a gig, or a crucial social signal.
And this hypermodulation profoundly alters our relationship with time, mastery, and skill. Consider human history prior to modernity. You could learn a trade in your youth, how to farm a specific crop, how to build masonry, how to forge metal.
Right.
And you could safely assume that knowledge would remain useful and economically viable enough to pass down to your grandchildren. To be modern is to accept that your tools, your software, your skills, and the platforms you rely on to make a living will be completely obsolete every few years. You must constantly retrain, rebrand, pivot, and re-engage with the market just to remain employable.
I have to pause and play the skeptic again here. Because I know there's a listener thinking, I actually like being connected. I like seeing my friends' photos. I like that I can work remotely from my laptop. Isn't this concept of hypermodulation just a dressed-up academic version of old people complaining that kids these days are always on their screens?
It is a totally valid critique to raise, but Rosa and Pettman are pointing to something much deeper than a moral panic about screen time. They aren't saying the technology is inherently evil. They are analyzing the structural economic burden operating behind the screen.
The structural burden, right.
Why do you feel the compulsion to answer work emails at 9:00 p.m. on a Tuesday? Ranger argues it's because external structural capitalist pressures drive this excess sociability. We are accelerating because our managers, the algorithms governing the gig economy, and our own precarious financial reality dictate that if we can be available, we must be available.
Oh, man.
If you step off the digital treadmill, if you choose to disconnect, You risk losing your livelihood in an economy that offers no safety net. It is an ideological reproduction of standstill, where the technology is weaponized to enforce constant ambient labor under the friendly guise of connectivity.
Wow, okay, so let's look at the totality of what we've uncovered. We are paralyzed by the G-force of the present. We are running as fast as humanly possible, constantly retraining just to pay for a cost-of-thriving basket that keeps moving further out of reach. We are renting homes we can't afford from a generation that locked up this supply.
It's a lot.
And meanwhile, we look around and realize that the grand, optimistic physical futures of the past, the lunar colonies, the flying cars, the utopian cities with limitless energy, they never arrived. We got Twitter instead. How does a culture process that specific kind of grief? How do you mourn a future that was promised but never delivered?
Well, when a culture hits a psychological and economic wall of that magnitude, it almost always turns to art to express the collective unconscious. And in our sources, there is a fascinating exploration of a specific aesthetic and musical genre that perfectly captures this exact lingering feeling of grief. It is called hauntology.
Hauntology. It's a brilliant term. It was originally coined in a political context by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida in the 1990s, but it was adapted and applied to music and culture in the 2000s by brilliant cultural theorists like Mark Fisher and Simon Reynolds.
Yes, exactly.
The Wikipedia source details how this genre emerged primarily in the United Kingdom, pioneered by electronic artists like Burial, The Caretakers, and the Boards of Canada.
The sound of hauntology is highly specific, and the mechanics of how the music is constructed are vital to understanding the message. These artists rely heavily on sampling, but they aren't sampling popular disco hits or classic rock.
Right. What are they sampling?
They dig into the archives of British cultural memory from the 1930s through the 1970s. They sample obscure public information films, educational broadcasting, and the early eerie electronic experiments of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. And crucially, they don't clean the audio up. They actively foreground the decay of the physical medium itself.
Right. If you listen to a Burial track, it is just drowning in vinyl crackle, tape hiss, and audio artifacts. It sounds like you are listening to a degraded cassette tape found in the ruins of an abandoned city.
The decay is the point. The audio artifacts serve as sonic markers of a time that has passed, evoking dead presences. They are literally creating the sound of a ghost. But as Mark Fisher argues so eloquently, hauntology is not merely retro.
It's not just nostalgia.
No, it isn't just cheap nostalgia for the fashion or the aesthetics of the 1970s. It is mourning what he calls a lost utopianism.
Let's unpack the mechanism of that mourning.
Yeah.
What exactly does Fisher mean by a lost utopianism?
They are mourning the future that the past promised. The post-war era, particularly in the UK with the establishment of the welfare state, was infused with a massive societal sense of forward momentum.
There was hope.
Huge hope. There was a genuine structural belief in benevolent public institutions. There was an assumption of continuous linear improvement in living standards. The idea that the physical world, the atoms, would be mastered and harnessed for the public good, providing housing, healthcare, and security for all.
And as we've spent the last hour discussing, that mastery of the physical world stalled. The great decoupling severed economic security from productivity. The housing market was financialized, locking out the youth. The physical future was canceled.
Yes.
So hauntology is the soundtrack to that realization. Mark Fisher calls it contemporary electronic music's confrontation with a cultural impasse, the failure of the future.
That's a powerful quote.
It makes me think of an analogy. Imagine walking through the grounds of an abandoned World's Fair. You go to these old sites in New York or Seattle, and you see these rusting, retro-futuristic structures. The monorails, the space needles, the pavilions of tomorrow.
I can picture that.
When you look at them, you aren't just looking at old architecture. You are looking at someone else's broken dream of tomorrow. You are standing in the physical wreckage of a promise that society failed to keep. Hauntology does that with sound.
That is exactly how the aesthetic functions, and it connects perfectly to the central paradox of this entire deep dive. The reason you look back at past decades and feel a sense of loss isn't just a trick of the mind. It isn't just because you are ungrateful for your smartphone.
Right.
It is because that era was objectively more abundant in its baseline economic accessibility. The cost of thriving was mathematically lower. The social contract, the belief that if you worked a standard job, you could afford a home, raise a family, and feel secure in your physical environment, was intact.
We are haunting our own culture because we recognize deep in our bones that the economic foundation required to thrive was dismantled. The mechanism of wealth building was pulled up like a ladder by the generations before us. We were handed shiny, endlessly entertaining digital toys to pacify us and distract us from the fact that we can't afford the rent.
We traded the physical reality of a secure, advancing future for the hypermodulated, frenetic standstill of the digital present. And hauntology is the sound of a culture finally waking up and recognizing the horror of that trade.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started with the psychological squeeze of the progress paradox, moved through the brutal math of the cost of thriving index and the housing crisis, unpacked the great decoupling and the hollowing out of the middle class, explored the great stagnation of the physical world, and ended with the haunting grief for lost futures. So, the ultimate question remains, what do we do with all this? If you are listening to this, feeling the G-force of the standstill, how do you escape?
The synthesis of our sources suggests that the first necessary step is a radical redefinition of what we consider progress. We have to look back to Greg Easterbrook's conclusion. We can no longer allow progress to be measured solely by the processing speed of our microchips, the daily fluctuations of the stock market, or aggregate GDP growth, especially when the data proves that growth does not translate into affordable housing or healthcare for the median citizen.
Easterbrook argues that true progress must evolve to encompass ethical and spiritual development. We have to change how we view our relationship to the economy. We must move away from the extreme individualism that blames the worker for failing to survive in a system that mathematically requires 53 weeks of income a year.
Exactly.
We have to demand a return to the physical world, focusing our ingenuity and capital on solving the problems of atoms, building massive amounts of dense housing, creating new clean energy infrastructure, and revitalizing transit, rather than just retreating further into the escapism of our screens.
It requires looking directly at the structural forces. We must challenge the zoning laws that artificially choke housing supply. We must challenge the mismeasurement of inflation that hides the reality of economic pain from policymakers. We have to address the architecture of the economy rather than medicating individuals for feeling anxious in a system that is perfectly designed to induce anxiety.
And that leads me to a final provocative thought I want to leave you with. Something to turn over in your mind long after you take your headphones off. We've spent this time dissecting how the physical world of atoms stalled for 50 years, while the digital world of bits accelerated so fast it gave us cultural whiplash.
Right.
But consider what is happening at this exact moment in time. Artificial intelligence is beginning to fully master and automate the digital realm. If AI can write the code, generate the media, synthesize the research, and process the data instantly, the endless frontier of digital innovation might finally hit a saturation point.
That's a really interesting point.
So the question is, will that saturation force human ingenuity, venture capital, and sheer economic necessity to finally turn back to the physical world? Will the absolute triumph of AI in the realm of bits be the catalyst that finally sparks the long-delayed revolution in atoms? Could the automation of the digital world finally force us to build the abundant housing, the new energy grids, and the physical future we've been waiting for since the 1970s?
It is a profound possibility. The only way out of a digital standstill might be to finally build the physical future we were promised.
Something to think about the next time you pull that supercomputer out of your pocket. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take a look at the world around you and the digital treadmill under your feet with fresh eyes. We'll see you next time.